Hello, this is Robert Rickover. I'm an Alexander Technique teacher in Omaha, Nebraska, and also teach in Toronto, or have until the last couple of years. My guest today is Imogen Ragone, who's an Alexander Technique teacher in Wilmington, Delaware. I think one of the things we both have in common is we both do a lot of our teaching online these days. So generally, when we have these conversations, I don't like to tell Imogen ahead of time what we're going to be talking about, because I'd like to make it as spontaneous as possible. But this time I did have to give her some homework to do before. And Imogen, do you want to say what that homework was?
Well, yeah, sure. My assignment was when I was out walking to experiment with using various different directions or little thoughts, both going uphill in an incline on a flat and maybe something a little bit in between, so just a slight incline. And I don't have any hugely steep hills, but I have some more hilly streets than others in my neighborhood. So the different thoughts or self-directions you wanted me to experiment with were: I'm doing less. I'm not doing. I'm stopping. I'm free. And I'm not walking.
Right.
I think that covers it, right?
Right.
And that I could use what
the difference was in your experience from using directions like those, most of which are negative directions of one kind or another, or inhibitory directions. What the difference was when you were walking up a hill versus on a flat surface.
Yeah, and what the difference between when I used them and when I wasn't, and you suggested if needed I could use a nonsense thought or direction to kind of help me let go of the self-direction. You suggested something like I'm green, so I played with that too. So
And what did you discover?
Okay. Well, what I discovered was most of the directions seemed to me to have a positive effect on my use, on the way I was moving and coordinating myself and how much tension I had in my body while I was walking, to maybe slightly different degrees. But there was one that seemed to, for me, again, this can always be very personal, that never seemed to have a positive effect.
Oh, really? Which one was that?
I'm stopping.
I'm stopping. Okay.
Which was a surprise to me, but in that context, it didn't. But what I noticed also is that some seemed more helpful than others. Some were kind of neutral, and some it was much clearer when I was going uphill than when I was on a flat surface.
So for me, when I did that kind of experiment, I found for me, it was the I'm doing less direction.
That was, especially going uphill, that was the most noticeably helpful or easing of the hard work that I would habitually put into going uphill. That seemed the most helpful. On the flat, I couldn't tell much difference between that and I'm free or I'm not walking. The I am not doing, I was sort of ambivalent about how it didn't seem unhelpful, but it didn't seem particularly useful either. So
Right. And I will say that in my neighborhood, and having moved to Omaha and
mhm,
fairly recently, there are hills everywhere here. And
mm,
there are some places where you could walk up quite a steep little incline, because not only do we have streets, but there are little walkways that connect parallel streets that are at very different levels.
mhm, mhm,
And there's one near me that is extraordinarily steep. You would definitely not want to be on that with any ice or snow or anything, but it is
mhm,
quite a steep incline. And what I found, when I was using that direction, I'm doing less, basically, which
mhm,
we've talked about in a previous interview, that the difference, that thought made an immediate huge difference. And I didn't even really have to do a lot of testing. I mean, I did some, but it was like an immediate shift and a dramatic one. And the reason that I find that interesting is that, really two reasons. One, I was struck by how just a simple, very light thought would make such a big difference.
mm,
And that got me to thinking about the whole question of, well, some people say the Alexander technique is all about choice, right? You can choose whether you do something in your habitual way or in a new way that might be better. And to me, it seems like choice is really only choice if it's a pretty simple choice to make. You know what I mean? Like if you just say, okay, I'm doing less.
mhm. So
Uh,
what you could say is that you're choosing to give yourself that self-direction, and you're choosing to give up how that plays out, and
totally.
the, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you're not doing anything. You're not
Mhm,
implementing anything. You're just
mhm,
thinking this very light thought, I'm doing less,
mhm,
which you can repeat as often as you choose. And it makes this, and when you throw it away, like go back to a nonsense thought, like I'm green, or just think I'm walking, suddenly you're just moving in a clunky, heavy way compared to where you were before. And it's very dramatic on a hill. So
mhm.
that got me
I
thinking, well, yeah, choice, if you're really talking about the Alexander technique as providing choice, there's a pretty good example where that's very clear to the
mhm,
student. And I realized that if I'm ever going to be teaching anyone in person again, I'm going to take them out to this little hill near me. It's about a 2-minute walk from my house, and we
mhm,
can walk up quite a steep hill together. And they can, and it's different from, say, a staircase kind of thing. It's like it is still
mhm.
walking, but it's not step, step, step. It's a continuous upward slope.
Yeah, one thing that struck me about why it seems so much more obvious, or I mean dramatic in a subtle way, if you know what I mean,
Mhm.
the change when I was walking uphill was that, um and the change, um out of it too, when I came to just walking again, or thinking I'm green or whatever, is that, um I obviously have a habitual tendency to use more effort walking uphill than I do on the flat. So there's not as big a comparison. And I have a more habitual tendency to immediately go back to using more effort than
Mhm.
needed.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
it felt very helpful indeed. Yeah. Yeah. But the I'm stopping was very interesting to me, because it felt like I was telling myself to put the brakes on, and yet I was continuing. So felt like there's
Mhm.
tension and resistance between
Right.
it, rather than not I use the words I'm stopping in other contexts, but just I'm stopping like that for me was not helpful. So yeah.
Right. So this is something that anyone watching this just needs to experiment with. But
I did experiment because I couldn't help myself, because I use freedom directions more all the time. I tend to use them a lot more than the negative or inhibitory directions. That I did experiment with. I'm free to do less. I'm free to do less. And seemed kind of similar to me. I think I respond. I have a nice response immediately to I'm free, and then the do less is added. That was a helpful addition.
Yeah. Well, that's basically all I wanted to talk about. Do you have any other thoughts on this?
Only that on the flat, I don't think for me that I'm doing less or I'm free to do less was noticeably more helpful than I'm free or I'm not walking. But it was distinctly the most helpful one. The more strenuous the steeper the incline I was going up. Yeah.
And I think a lot of people, when they look at a hill that they're about to climb, they have an idea of what they have to do to climb it that probably involves quite a bit of extra doing that they don't need. It's a little analogous maybe to Alexander's own situation when he had his voice issue on stage. They didn't have in ordinary life, and that's what actually caused him to seek a solution to that, which led to the Alexander technique. Speaking just one-on-one with somebody at the pub, it was no big deal. But when he was on stage and he wanted to reach the people in the back of the auditorium, and there's no PA system, he did all kinds of extra stuff, particularly around his head and neck area, that was getting in the way. And it was real obvious. And then once he discovered that, then he could see, oh yeah, even when I'm just talking normally, there's a little bit of that, but it had not been noticeable. So I think it's a good teaching technique for anyone who works with people in activities like walking. If you can arrange to have because you probably can't do this right during the lesson, but if you encourage your students to use it on a hill when they're walking, they can have the same kind of experience and really get those whatever direction works best for them. Hey, that's pretty powerful, but and doesn't require any real effort. It's just a choice. It's just a choice.
Beauty of it. Yeah.
Nothing more. Okay, should we end it on that note?
Sure.
Okay, so my guest today has been Imogen Ragone, an Alexander teacher in Wilmington, Delaware. I'll put a link to her website by the interview, and also to a site that will tell you more about the technique and help you find the teacher. And I think maybe I'll put a link to a site that'll talk more about Alexander directions as well. So Imogen, thank you so much.